Hi everybody, welcome to Insight. It's Tony's turn today and he's making a very special original drink.
So today we're going to make a cocktail called the North Garden, which is a drink I had at Death & Company, which is this great cocktail bar in the East Village in Manhattan. And they are famous for being one of the first juggernauts to take the classic cocktail recipes in the early part of the craft cocktail movement and doing very interesting spins on them. So this is kind of a very loose translation of an old-fashioned. And it's basically a fall-like beverage that a bartender created when a patron asked, "Make me a drink that tastes like the great American novel." So this is kind of a little Hemingway, I think. So we're going to begin with our mixing glass full of ice, and we're going to begin with a bonded, which means 100 proof, apple brandy. And with this, we're going to do 1.5 ounces per drink. And then we're going to take bourbon. I'm using a Four Roses single barrel, also 100 proof. And we're going to do 3/4 ounces per drink. And then, surprise, this is the twist, an Islay scotch. In this case, Laphroaig. We're going to do 1/4 ounce per drink.
Smoky, smoky, smoke.
Indeed.
I just think that Laphroaig tastes like drinking a piece of peat that you would burn on the
Indeed,
fire.
yeah, that's the thing about Islay scotch is that it's very low down near the coastline. Lots of peat and moss in the flavors. And then we're going to do just about a bar spoon of simple syrup per drink. A little bit less than you would normally use in an old fashioned, but that apple brandy makes up for it. And lastly, I'm going to use about a dash or two of bitters per cocktail or per drink. Have some charred cedar and currant bitters. Okay, then we're going to stir that for 30 seconds. Then we'll strain it over one large ice sphere.
Very nice.
And no garnish on this one. There we have it.
Thank you.
Let's give it a whirl. Cheers.
What's it called again?
A North Garden.
North Garden, okay.
It is smoky.
It's certainly not too sweet.
Yeah, indeed.
Smoky, peaty, folly.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, very, very nice.
All right. So we have kind of a change of pace this week for our masterworks. The first two we had were all either classical or neoclassical works, 18th century, 20th century, and I think that worked really well. This week we also have a piece from the 18th century and one from the 20th century, but the 20th century piece is very different. It's not neoclassical at all. It's dramatic and programmatic. Tell us a little bit about this work.
So the piece is written by James MacMillan, who is the most famous living Scottish composer. He's in his 60s now. He's been famous for a long time. And early on in his career in 1990, 30 years ago, he was commissioned by the BBC for the Proms. And the piece that he wrote launched his international career and has been played really an enormous amount since. It's really become a repertoire piece. The title of it is The Confession of Isobel Gowdie. And it's a piece that roughly tells the story of something that happened in the past, but not really, and we'll come back to that. After the Reformation in Scotland, there were a great number of executions of women who were believed to be witches. Mm-hmm. So roughly between the years of 1560 and the early 1700s, thousands of women were drowned or burnt at the stake because they were believed to be witches. And it was partly because, if you imagine before the Reformation, it was considered virtuous to do things like pray to saints, to leave milk out for the fairies, those kinds of superstitious things. Right. Those all suddenly became illegal when the Reformation happened, and particularly Scotland, like Northern Ireland, where I'm from, the form of Reformation was very strict.
It was Calvinist.
It was Calvinism. Yeah. It was John Knox from Switzerland, from Geneva, right. And it was this very brutal, literal, quite hardcore Reformation theology.
Right.
So all these things that have been perfectly normal habits and even approved of became illegal and became a sign that you were a witch.
Right.
And the introduction to the piece and the score, the composer writes some wonderful things. But when it comes to what he was doing in the piece, I'd like to just read it because it explains it very clearly. So initially I was drawn by the dramatic and programmatic potential of this insane and terrible story. But the work soon developed a far more emotional core as I attempted to draw together various strands in a single complicated act of contrition. That's very important because the atmosphere of the piece is very contrite and requiem-like.
Yeah.
On behalf of the Scottish people, the work craves absolution and offers Isabel Gowdie the mercy and humanity that was denied her in her last days of her life. To do this, I've tried to capture the soul of Scotland in music. That's again very important. There's lots of stuff that sounds like Scotland. Many sections contain a multitude of chants, songs, and litanies, real and imagined, coming together in a reflective outpouring, a prayer for the murdered woman. This work is the requiem that Isabel Gowdie never had.
Yeah, and referring to some of the folk-ish content, the chants and the songs, real and imagined, I presume he's referring to some are actual pre-existing Scottish chants and folk tunes, and some are just ones that he wrote to be evocative of that. But either way, he's really setting the place by making such distinctly Scottish music.
And it's very interesting because this is a piece that sounds very modern and very old at the same time.
Yes.
A good way to think about MacMillan is to, first of all, understand that he's a deeply religious man and he's very Catholic. And often plain chants, Latin texts, prayers become the focus of his music, very similar to the way Olivier Messiaen, the French composer, was obsessed with his Catholic faith. So MacMillan often draws on these elements to create music, but he's absolutely a modernist. There isn't a kind of, he's not a neo-composer. And even though the shape of this piece is very elegiac, then very violent, and then very elegiac again, this is not a kind of reworking of the past. It's taking material from the past, but he's got strong modernist hands, if you like, that are molding it into something completely new.
Very much so. So he mentions the word programmatic. What is that in musical terms, and how does that apply to the construct of this piece?
Well, I think the opening is music of consolation, of prayer. Maybe it's Isabel Gowdie praying for her soul before she dies. Then the music in the middle is very violent, and there are all these structures that keep rising and then falling and rising and falling, and it's like, I suppose it could be smoke. I mean, I don't want to get too graphic about what's going on, but something very violent and unpleasant is happening. And then there is this sense of kind of outpouring of emotion and of grief at the end. And the ending of the piece is brilliant.
Fascinating.
One note, middle C.
In unison
In the whole orchestra. Gradually one instrument after another, just screeching to a halt, very suddenly cut off, 5 fortes. And it's terrifying. It's like the music is being strangled, being cut short. Yeah,
and it's not just one necessarily sustained. I mean, there's like a pulse happening, and then a snare drum enters. I mean, it's just it makes me hold my breath. I've listened to this, I can't count how many times, and every time I find myself holding my breath at the end, just exhaling. It's so dramatic.
It is.
And powerful.
So I've wanted to program this piece for years, and I'm very excited that we're finally doing it next week.
It should be great, and I think you're very spot on that it's definitely reflective of something. I mean, there's this motive that keeps happening in the violins and the strings, in the more elegiac sections. That's sort of this almost downward gliding mode.
Yes.
It's almost like weeping or
well, it
tears.
says in the score like a sigh.
Yeah, right.
He actually writes that in the score.
And some of the string rhythms that are occurring around that are almost very speech-like rhythmically and almost conversational. So it's practically like a wordless opera in a sense, like these. So I'm very excited about this, and then it's followed by I'm someone who kind of is inclined toward hyperbole on a regular basis, but I think maybe my favorite symphony of all symphonies, the last one Mozart ever wrote, is 41st, the Jupiter, which I would go as far to say is basically perfect.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Often when Mozart is at his best, you feel like there's no human component between God and music.
Yep.
It's like it's just been passed with no deterioration
I've
through the
always-
vessel of Mozart.
That's exactly how I've always described Mozart as well, which is so different than Beethoven, which you can just hear the effort and
And
the
the
work.
humanity.
And
So anyway, Jupiter. Well, the first thing that's interesting is why did he write it? In the summer of 1788, Mozart wrote his final three and greatest symphonies, the E flat major, the G minor, and Jupiter. And there isn't a single other example of him writing anything, let alone any symphony, without a commission as an adult, because he was always very much a businessman and not a particularly
And
good
broke,
one. He was
right.
broke when he was writing this. We don't know why he wrote it, so that's special because maybe he was doing it for himself. He was trying to show what he was capable of in the symphony.
Yeah.
And it helps us in Jupiter because, particularly in the finale, he does so many unusual things. So anyway, classical symphony, 4 movements. It's hard to talk about this music because it's music. It doesn't really have a whole lot of other stuff going on. But the first movement starts with kind of energetic fanfare figures, which is supposedly why the editor Salomon at the time called it Jupiter, because it reminded the opening imagine of Jupiter's thunderbolts.
Right.
But there are a million different ideas on that. The second movement I find one of Mozart's most profound, beautifully slow Adagio with unbelievably beautiful themes, and that sense of decor and poise and classical balance, but enormous human emotion and grief. And some of the dissonances in the second movement are absolutely hair-raising. Then a very buoyant minuet and trio. The trio is very funny. Tovey has a wonderful line which says that the trio is perfectly polite as long as it gets exactly its own way, which I think is very pretty. And then the finale, which we need to talk about a little bit more. Finales in classical symphonies are usually rondos or sonata allegros, which have 2 themes, or in the case of a rondo, 1. What Mozart does here is he has 5 different themes, 5 little short themes, and he had recently become interested in Bach's music, and of course Bach above all means counterpoint. Counterpoint, yes, there's lots of it in classical music obviously, but it's not a goal in the way that it was in Baroque music. In Baroque music, counterpoint is the ultimate goal, and counterpoint is merging many lines together so that you can hear all of them equally and democratically, not melody and accompaniment. That's the opposite of counterpoint. The classical period tends to be a lot more about melody and about proportion. We don't see the same emphasis on counterpoint.
Right.
So when Mozart decides to write a fugal finale, which means that all 5 of these little voices are equal and coming on top of each other all the time, he's doing something very unusual. And the fusion of those fugal elements, those Baroque elements, with the classical style is really fascinating.
Yeah.
So we get introduced to all these 5 themes, and we go through an exposition, development, recap, but then in the coda of the last movement, the last 2 minutes, Mozart shows us the degree of his virtuosity and plays all 5 themes on top of each other, one after another, upside down, in the middle of the texture, on top of the texture, as the bass line. And this is something that is very difficult to do. You know, when we study music at university or at music college, we learn how to write fugues, and it takes us years to write these very basic, clunky things. It's so difficult. One of the most difficult things I've ever had to do is write a fugue in an exam hall.
And most of the time they're 3-voice fugues as opposed to 5-voice.
Yeah.
As a student.
So we had to do 4 and 5
okay.
actually.
Good for you.
But
That's the English system versus American.
But to do this in a way that actually makes good music and that gives you this kind of mental orgasm, for want of a better word, music that is just so
Absolutely.
unbelievably exciting cerebrally as well as emotionally,
Absolutely.
is something that's unparalleled in music. And I mean, there's literally nothing more exciting. And I will also say from personal experience that there's no other piece of music I know that stays with me so long after I've conducted it the finale of Jupiter is whirring around in your head
Yeah.
3 weeks after, won't go away, won't let you sleep.
That doesn't surprise me.
It's a very special piece of music, and I think above all of Mozart's works, it shows us his almost superhuman creativity. That this is something so perfect that it's hard to believe that a human being created it.
Yeah, and he was in his early 30s when he wrote it. I mean, and he just died, another 2 to 3 years after this.
Mm-hmm.
And what we, could have seen if he had made it to 50 is staggering. And what I think is just lovely about so much late Mozart is there are glimmers of things that we often attribute to Beethoven, but Mozart was already beginning to employ them. Shorter themes that eventually and counterpoint that really give way to motivic structure.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Yeah.
You see him literally cutting classical length themes in half into shorter blocks. Yeah,
and every note becomes more functional and less, well, maybe functional isn't the right word, but it's serving a more specific purpose rather than filling just sort of a harmonic place underneath a melody.
Yeah, tighter organization.
Yeah.
So, like, these two pieces have nothing to do with each other.
No.
For once, there is not a overarching concert theme, but they're going to be very exciting back to back.
Well, the first piece does sort of take us into a place of, grief and despair, and the Mozart to end the concert is one of the most. It's full of elation. It's more than almost anything I can think of, and again, the end of the finale, the coda, is maybe the greatest minute of music ever composed in the symphonic repertoire.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
So
we hope to see you.
Hope to see you there.
Cheers.